has the right to live in peace and health and freedom.
The 1960s in the United States was a time of tremendous change. The country, embroiled in the Vietnam War overseas, was ideologically at war with itself through the civil rights movement. The 1960s saw a rise in protests, most notably among college students, stemming from a strong belief that the United States need not have involved itself in the highly controversial Vietnam War. At this time, the United States battled an environmental crisis that continues to threaten the health and prosperity of those living within its confines and humanity as well. Highly influential books such as early environmentalist Rachael Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, brought to light the story of how bird populations were greatly afflicted by the extensive use of synthetic pesticides, most notably DDT. Carson's work helped expose the American government's knowing neglect of the regulations on pollution, pesticide use, and other environmental catastrophes such as the smog crisis of New York and Los Angeles and the Santa Barbara oil disaster further heightened tensions between the government and the populace. Minority groups who were disproportionately affected by such man-made disasters led some of the most fervent protests against the status quo of environmental degradation. Richard Nixon's National Environmental Policy Act, signed on January 1st, 1970, sought to, quote, create and maintain conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony. The bill aimed to, quote, assure for all Americans safe, healthful, productive, aesthetically and culturally pleasing surroundings. Inspired by these developments, a group of students at the University of Michigan formed the organization known as ENACT, or Environmental Action for Survival. Established in the autumn of 1969, the group planned a teach-in for the following spring in 1970, aimed at raising awareness for the looming environmental crisis plaguing the nation. The teach-in attracted national media coverage and thousands of attendees, featuring events that highlighted problems associated with an exponentially growing population, negative environmental impacts from increased emissions, mainly those from transportation, as well as the impacts that large corporations such as Coca-Cola were having on the environment. On October 29, 1969, ENACT announced that a major teach-in would take place in March of 1970. This event was reminiscent of the Vietnam teach-in that occurred back in 1965. The teach-in, as a form of protest, was invented here at the University of Michigan. On January 21st, about a month and a half before the teach-in, ENACT organizers sent the university administration a letter informing them about their plans for the teach-in and urging the university to participate. Because the university was a public institution with many resources at its disposal, organizers felt that the university was duty-bound to inform the public of the dangers posed to the environment. The letter emphasizes the educational potential for this event and states that, quote, ENACT will help the university achieve this goal. Douglas Scott, David Allen, and Elizabeth Grant, who sent the letter, were three of the principal organizers of the ENACT teach-in, and co-chair David Allen even spoke at the teach-in. Before the actual teach-in, there were a series of lectures planned by ENACT. These lectures took place in the late fall of 1969 and the early winter of 1970, with many of the lectures being given by university faculty to help raise awareness and engagement with the environmental movement. Once again, the movement was championed as an educational opportunity, and these lectures helped emphasize that point. Community outreach was utilized as an educational tool, an attempt to engage and educate the public outside of just the university's campus. With thousands of volunteers and attendees to organize, red tape and tribulations with getting official approval, the organizing of the ENACT teach-in was a massive undertaking with hundreds of workshops and events. Mirroring the Vietnam War teach-in of 1965, the Environmental Action for Survival teach-in continued the University of Michigan's exciting pioneering role in community-oriented education events of this nature. On the morning of Wednesday, March 11th, 1970, hundreds of students, community members gathered in a substantial effort to dramatize a, quote, car on trial. This event questioned America's dependence on cars, in this case a 1959 Ford sedan, and whether this dependence was created by an actual need or whether it could be done away with. This proceeding revealed the abundance of automobile emissions released daily and brought to light the damage its effects had on Earth's atmosphere. The heightened excitement of an actual car on trial concluded with an execution sentence of the car, which culminated in it being smashed violently by students in the community. For $1, participants could hit the car, and this money from smashing the car went to a fund defending 13 protesters who were arrested for demonstrating against a General Electric recruiter who had come to campus during the year. ENACT gave an exciting opening number for the days following by critiquing automotive dependence, which called the community together in mass action and educational experience. This event echoed a need for solutions and the survival of Earth. Following the car on trial, students began acting on a promise made in a letter to the University of Michigan's president, Robert Fleming. The letter was written on March 10th, urging the university to divest from the Coca-Cola company, which had no can return or bottle policy for a recycling program. Moving forward, 200 students addressed this issue and marched several miles to Coca-Cola to dump thousands of Coke cans they had carried there. At this time, Michigan had non-returnable cans, which became normalized until the state of Michigan enacted the bottle bill, which would end up being a key legacy of the 1970 teach-in. The march was reported by the 311 news team, which broadcasted an outcry which led to Ann Arbor's recycling initiative. The kickoff rally for the teach-in also took place on Wednesday, March 11th. 13,000 people attended, with almost 15% of the population of Ann Arbor crammed into a packed Chrysler Arena. The massive crowd witnessed speakers such as Gaylord Nelson, the Wisconsin senator responsible for the creation of Earth Day, Robin Fleming, the university president at the time, Michigan Governor William Milliken, radio and TV host Arthur Godfrey, geneticist James Shapiro, and biologist Barry Commoner. Popular folk artist Gordon Lightfoot also gave a performance during the event, and the cast of the musical Hair made an appearance as well, which added to the draw of the keynote. The multitude of perspectives presented by government officials, academic experts, and pop culture figures allowed legislative and scientific ideas to come together in a public forum. This holistic approach to discussing environmental problems aimed to be inclusive and broad. An established ecological approach was prioritized by ENACT rather than an environmental justice initiative, which is a key difference in current environmental movements of today. Barry Commoner, a famous biologist from Washington University, who was later cited as a founder of the modern environmental movement and who eventually ran for president under the Citizens Party in 1980, gave a keynote speech. Commoner stated, quote, "We cannot defer for long a confrontation with the real debt that we owe to nature, the total reorganization of our system of productivity to make it compatible with the ecosystem." The theme of Thursday was prompted by the work of Paul R. Ehrlich, an American biologist and author of The Population Bomb, a book which advocates for immediate action to limit population growth. Throughout the day, multiple workshops were held all over the Ann Arbor community, including high schools and the University of Michigan campus. Many workshops highlighted the dangers of exponential growth of the population and solutions to cease it. Questions and statements such as, quote, "Can we blame the population growth on the ghetto?" and, quote, "Sock it to motherhood, make love, not babies," were used to emphasize the fear of overpopulation and potential remedies. ENACT pushed to advocate women and families to only have 2 children. Those in favor of population control advocated for abortion to be legal, for women to be, quote, fully integrated into the labor force, and to limit their number of children. Tax benefits as compensation would be given to couples who marry at older ages, and the promotion for sex education to be generalized across the country while having an emphasis on the ecological effect of large populations. Previous to the Thursday workshops, University of Michigan students encouraged people to sign the ENACT Pledge of Social Responsibility. The pledges of social responsibility encouraged people to have only 2 children or pledge to stop having children if they already have more than 2. It was promoted in the Michigan Daily to reach students, faculty members, and local residents.
The energy from the ENACT teach-in continued its momentum into Friday, where hundreds of people gathered on the University of Michigan Diag for an eco-rally. The Ann Arbor News described the scene as a bizarre setting of children on roller skates, loose dogs, flying frisbees, freaky music, and bubbles floating through the air. Environmental leaders shared their perspectives on the environmental crisis with the crowd. Ecologist Dr. Hugh Illitis kicked off the event by warning attendees that the ecosystem will turn sour and begin to impact the psychological and emotional health of everyone as he dramatically waved a flower at the crowd. Representative Paul McCloskey, also present, stressed the importance of going to the polls and voting for representatives who oppose the Vietnam War, as ending the war would increase funds to end environmental deterioration. This rally kicked off the Friday of the ENACT teach-in with a sense of urgency and continued to raise anticipation for the evening's major event. A panel-style town hall at Pioneer High School titled Root Causes of the Environmental Crisis, which included panelists with a diverse array of perspectives. The event succeeded in its goal of reaching out to not only college students but to the surrounding community, which led to a turnout of 2,500 people, more than what the auditorium could hold. One of the more controversial speakers was Theodore Dome, the president of Dow Chemical. Outside the event, anti-war activists protested Dow as environmental criminals for its production of napalm used in the Vietnam War.
Do you think this environmental problem can be licked within the existing framework? This is the question the college students are now raising.
This is the thing I'm surest of. It can be solved, and I'll make this point tonight. There isn't any question in my mind but what we can solve it. I think we've got to start talking more about solutions, how we solve it, rather than talking about the fact that we've got a problem.
Other speakers included Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers and a fierce advocate for an alliance between labor and environmentalists, followed by Senator Edmund Muskie, who promoted reforms within the existing system and encouraged students to get involved in policymaking. Finally, Murray Bookchin, a radical activist and writer, gave a presentation titled Ecology and Revolutionary Thought that pushed for decentralized, self-sufficient anarchist communities that would live in anti-capitalist harmony with nature. Closing out Friday, the Pioneer High School panel offered diverse and in some cases controversial perspectives on the cause of the environmental crisis and built up attention leading into Saturday's events. The next day, Saturday, March 14th, ENACT's keynote address was given by political activist, author, and attorney Ralph Nader, and he began his speech by defining the environment.
The environment is anything that affects man, whether it comes from private power, public power, fellow citizens, whether it takes the form of contaminating the air and the water and soil, or the food, or whether it takes the form of slum tenements, hunger in the rural areas, semi-starvation, malnutrition, and all of the effects which bear so critically on the health and well-being of man, regardless of his position in the economic ladder or regardless of what racial group he belongs to.
Also on Saturday, ENACT organized a Huron River Walk that included experts stationed along the river who spoke about the area and possible plans for it. Protesters on the Huron River Walk held up signs that read, Huron River, not Huron Sewer, fish or fowl, and don't fill it up, clean it up. The teach-in on the environment created a medium of collaboration amongst diverse groups within the Ann Arbor area, and emphasized the widespread awareness of the delicate balance upon which life on this earth depends. The ENACT teach-in created opportunities for workshops, panels, films, seminars, and displays, which all worked towards planning constructive action goals. They solicited the support of all members of the community. Despite this mission of community involvement, one controversy that weighed on the ENACT teach-in was the lack of Black voices present at their events. During the time of the teach-in, the Black Action Movement was very vocal on campus in fighting for representation and support for future and present Black students at U of M. This increased attention on Black representation manifested itself in the Vanguard, a Black student group who boycotted the Scream Out event. The student group believed that this event would be nothing more than a shouting match between members talking about the symptoms and not environmental problems. Initially, ENACT responded that they were disappointed in the decision, but recognized that these issues affect everyone, especially the Black community. After this backlash, ENACT began to take these issues of representation more seriously, and they started by adding Ed Faber of the Black Action Movement to the lineup of speakers at the kickoff event. In his speech, he emphasized how environmentalists often forget how issues of pollution disproportionately affected Black communities. ENACT continued their mission for more representation by submitting a formal apology letter citing their lapses in judgment as a group. This letter ends on a particularly important note, so that the questions of social equality and that of the environment do not work at cross purposes, but become complementary. This conflict made ENACT more aware of Black issues and emphasized the importance of coalition building when starting a social movement. ENACT continued working towards building coalitions, especially with the UAW. Coalition building is not only important for including the voices of the historically unheard, it is also important strategically for moving the movement forward, which is something UAW President Walter Reuther recognized. While jobs and environmental quality have historically been pitted against one another, and still are today, the ENACT teach-in demonstrated what a labor environmentalist alliance could look like. Walter Reuther blamed the reliance on marketplace values as he spoke at the ENACT teach-in and emphasized the strategic importance of an environmentalist labor alliance. Under Reuther's leadership, the UAW passed a resolution that said, "Unchecked pollution by the automobile and related industries is of direct concern to auto workers, not only because they are citizens concerned for their environment, but because there is a direct threat to their jobs and their job security." The recognition of importance of environmental issues by labor was not only critical for gaining support in numbers, but also because these unions had the power to negotiate legally binding contracts with their employers. While speaking at the 1970 UAW convention, Reuther suggested the union use this tactic. Because the industry has for so long polluted the environment of the plants in which we work and has now created an environmental crisis of catastrophic proportions in the communities in which we live, the UAW will insist on discussing the implications of this crisis at the bargaining table. Walter Reuther hoped to continue the conversation with a meeting between students, environmentalists, and union representatives, but passed away shortly after ENACT in a plane crash, which stalled but didn't completely halt the progress of a labor-environment alliance. The tactics he encouraged 50 years ago are still being used today. The Graduate Student Union on the University of Michigan's campus in 2020 is engaging in the same strategy Reuther proposed. They are including climate, housing, and social justice demands in their negotiations with the university. Through the last 50 years, many of ENACT's legacies have continued to live on. Even in 1970, one of the major issues ENACT members were concerned with was the advent of single-use aluminum and plastic containers. In one of the early events of the teach-in, students dumped hundreds of cans in front of the Coca-Cola bottling plant to protest the waste created by this industry.
I think one of the problems when you're dealing with something like beer cans is what do you do with them? Do you ban them, or do you just send out people to pick them up? And I think one of the problems now that we face, you see the tremendous amount of public relations activities in industry convincing us that we have to return our beer cans for half a cent or something like this, rather than really going to the root of the problem and just stopping the use of them altogether.
But it was a compromise that ultimately led to the landmark Bottle Bill of 1976. David DeVarty, a former member of ENACT while at Pioneer High School, joined up with fellow U of M students Greg Hesterberg and Tim Coonan to start a petition to get bottle legislation rolling. They traveled city to city across Michigan and held rallies to educate the public on negative environmental effects of single-use cans and the benefits of a bottle return program. The bill ultimately passed for 10 cents a can, which to this day is the highest bottle return in the country. As of 2017, Michigan returns 96% of its bottles and cans, demonstrating the continuing success of the legislation and the legacy of the ENACT movement and its spin-offs.
What about the teach-in leaving the campus and going to the city? Are you going to take it there?
Yes, I hope very much that this will be the result of the teach-in is, for example, an ecology center set up in every town, a major town at least in this country. This would be an informational center, such as one in existence in Berkeley, California, and we're setting one up in Ann Arbor. And this will serve to continue at a lower key than the frantic pace of a 4-day teach-in and the informational aspect.
As Art Hansen explained, the purpose of the center was for environmental education to continue over decades. After the teach-in ended, the organization maintained a $70,000 budget surplus that members of ENACT wanted to make sure was used to continue the purpose of the movement. This surplus allowed for the initial funding of the Ecology Center, which was opened up only 2 months after the main teach-in events. During its opening week, the Ecology Center held a number of panels and events with topics ranging from environmental legislation to consumer action. To this day, they believe in getting to the source of issues and work to influence public policy as well as engage with corporations. The center helps not only local movements around Ann Arbor and the U of M campus, but also helps supporting national causes like testing consumer products for dangerous chemicals. The ENACT movement had a lasting impact within the Ann Arbor community. Students and community members have continued to build on the momentum that began in 1970 through protests and teach-ins. In March 2019, a global environmental protest took place with events in Ann Arbor where students and community members gathered on the University of Michigan Central Campus Diag and walked throughout downtown Ann Arbor to speak out against global climate change and apathy towards environmental issues. Ann Arbor organized to finish the walk at President Mark Schlissel's office, staging a teach-in to demand an hour of his time to discuss what can be done on the University of Michigan campus. As a result of the environmental movement on campus, the University of Michigan has now frozen all future investments into fossil fuels. ENACT successfully launched the nation's first ever Earth Day event. It had both achievements and shortcomings that have informed the environmental movement and helped spark the energy that propelled it forward. Its successes taught us that aligning with other groups such as labor unions can help make a movement stronger, and its shortcomings stress the importance of making space for communities often unheard, such as the Black Action Movement. The ENACT teach-in demonstrated the importance of community engagement, education, and building coalitions to create a successful environmental movement.